You know, when I think about craft and craft of writing, I think that really is about the process of constantly writing, and not just, we always talk a lot about rewriting, but that writing becomes a habit, and it becomes a thing that you do sort of whether you feel like doing it or not. It's one of those things that if you only write when you want to write, or when you're ready to write, or when you have something to say, you're not going to really write that much, or you'll write one thing, and it'll be the thing, which is fine, the thing that you are compelled to write and to get off your chest. But being an actual writer, and a writer who continues to produce, really means showing up when that page is really blank, and making the time available to just sort of sit there. And even, you know, when people have to have other jobs and things, is really, you know, blocking out, even if it's 20 minutes a day, that you get up at, you know, 6 o'clock in the morning and you write for 20 minutes. And it doesn't matter really what you write, it is the habit of writing is the first most important piece of that. And I often, when I teach, have students who say, oh, I only write when I have a deadline. And I think, well, you're screwed. Because you can't, you're not going to get very far, because at a certain point you don't have a deadline anymore. And nobody really, that's the thing about it, nobody really checks on you. And you know, it's a horrible job really, because you're left alone in your room, and it's not even like my friends who are painters who can talk on the phone while they're painting, and they wear these headsets now, and they listen to music, you know. The minute some noise happens, I'm completely distracted. You know, a car alarm 4 blocks away, and I'm the nutcase opening there, and I go, turn it off! You know, whatever. It's a hard thing to do, to live in a world where, especially I think when you're really working from your imagination, where you're making up people and places and things that never happened. It's exhausting, because you have to actually bring them to life. So that's the first piece of it, and I think it's a lot about just practicing. When I think about the difference between novels and short stories, I started writing when I was actually in high school, and I took 10th grade off, and I wrote this book of poems while locked in my room, smoking so many cigarettes that I have spots on my lungs now, with no ventilation whatsoever. A book called An Introduction to Death with Excerpts from Life. I highly don't recommend it. No, I think one day I might ultimately have to publish it. But anyway, it's these poems that kind of go like, I wish I was dead. I really wish I was dead. I'm going to give this to my mother to type. Boy, is she going to wish. Whatever. Anyhow, but you know, I think about when I first started writing, when I first started taking serious writing classes and graduate and undergraduate school. And I wrote maybe 2 short stories, and literally the teacher said, I think you should try to write a novel. And I remember thinking, really? Whatever makes you think that? Because I don't know anything about it. And I wrote 70 pages of a novel that was set somewhere in South Dakota, a place I'd really never been. And I wrote away for all these like brochures, you know, like the Chamber of Commerce. I was probably about 8 probably at the time, maybe 18, but I may as well have been 8. And to like the Chamber of Commerce of somewhere in South Dakota, and to every dude ranch for, you know, information. And I really couldn't do it, because I didn't even begin to, at that point, have the skills of storytelling to sustain, you know, a multi-100-page thing. But I think when I think about the difference between the novel and the short story, the first way I always describe it is that, to me, a novel is like taking a train cross-country, and it leaves New York, you know, on Friday night, and by Saturday at some point it's in Chicago, and then it's in New Mexico, and then it's wherever it's going, California. I think of the short story as being something that left New York the night before, and it's already in motion, you're jumping on in Chicago. It needs to have a certain kind of momentum all the way, already underway. It doesn't have the sort of the length that allows for sort of the leisurely unfolding of information. It's a kind of a much more compressed form. And I think what also interestingly happened to me over time was that my short stories actually got longer, but they didn't get any less compressed. And then my novels stayed long, but they got more compressed. So they're now sort of in my mind kind of having a problem where they're vying for a kind of specificity where I'll write a very long 45-page short story, and it is dense. And then I start writing a novel, and it is really dense too. And it's hard to write the 500-page dense novel, but we'll see how I do over time. But I think for me, the fundamental difference between the two is how information is laid out, is the first thing. And then secondarily, there are ideas that I have that I think would not work as a novel. So, a long time ago I wrote a short story called Esther in the Night about a woman whose kid is in a coma because he was in a car accident, and he's at home, hooked up to a lot of machines, and she goes in and puts a bag over his head and basically kills the kid. Now that wouldn't be a novel for me, because it's a very, very dark, very intense thing, but it's in its own bubble, and I think it only exists in a bubble like that. Another example is a story that I may read you a little bit from, called The Former First Lady and the Football Hero. I very much wanted to write a story about the Reagans, because who wouldn't want to write a story about the Reagans? And it was important to me that if I was writing about the Reagans, I didn't want to I don't feel a political affinity with them, but I found them to be a very interesting couple. But I didn't want to just sort of write, make fun of the Reagans. I wanted to understand them in some way. And yet for me, a story about the Reagans would not likely be a novel about the Reagans, if you know what I mean. I felt they were fascinating, but a novel for me is like getting married, and I really didn't want to marry Ron and Nancy, because that's like a 5-year commitment. As it was, I had the idea for the story, and it took me several years to figure out how to tell a story about the Reagans, because I was interested in the fact of sort of an incredibly public life evaporating, and the relationship of Alzheimer's to kind of public life and to history, and kind of what that meant, and lots of other things. But it took me forever to figure it out, and I actually read all these books about the Reagans, including Ronnie's first book, his first autobiography, first of many, that was called Where's the Rest of Me? Which I think is a very telling title. It came out early in like 1961 or 62. And then Nancy's astrologer's book, of course. And then really anything I could get my hands on. And it wasn't until somebody told me that Ron and Nancy were still sleeping in the same bed, even though he had fairly advanced Alzheimer's. And it was told to me along the lines of, Ron and Nancy are sleeping in the same bed, even though the doctor says Nancy shouldn't anymore. Which I always think, what does that mean? Like, why did the doctor think that Nancy shouldn't sleep in the same bed with him? Was he going to, and people with Alzheimer's historically can be violent at times and all kinds of things, but I kept thinking, what exactly is going on there that, And again, that didn't really make its way into the story, but it was one of the aspects of it. But anyway, I'm going to read you a little bit of that story. And then as contrast, so that was a story I wrote a few years ago, but not that long ago. And long before that, and this is sort of a little bit, it's going to sound like a non sequitur, but about structure of how I organize a story collection. My first collection of stories was called The Safety of Objects, and it came out in 1990. And the last story in that is a story called A Real Doll, about a boy who's dating a Barbie doll. And it became this kind of cult classic and spun off this other book called Mondo Barbie, which was all the various writings people had done about their relationship to Barbie and all kinds of things. And then 10 years later, so in 2000, as I was, it takes me a long time to write these stories, but as organizing the next collection, I was again thinking about the relationship of stories to each other, but also I very much like to write about not just icons of popular culture like Barbie or the Reagans, but things that are both historical and that I think in a way tell us things about ourselves and about where we are located in time and place. So I wanted to sort of, when organizing the collections of stories, I put the Reagan story, the former First Lady and the Football Hero, at the end of the book as well. So the Barbie story and the Reagan story are sort of parallels, and if you ever look at the two collections, I mean, not that they're similar, but they are structured somewhat similarly. So I'm going to start by reading a little bit of the story, A Real Doll, and then I'll read you the Reagan story. And what I'll tell you about A Real Doll is I wrote it when I was in graduate school at the University of Iowa. And it started off innocently enough, which it started off by my just thinking about Barbie and wanting to write something nice about a boy dating a Barbie doll. And I actually went and bought a Barbie in Iowa City, and they only had my first Barbie, which I think really means Virgin Barbie, because she comes, no joke, in a white dress and all these white things, and the buttons on her clothing are bigger so that little hands can undo them more easily than, I don't know what, like non-Virgin Barbie or something, But I just always thought it's like the strangest phrase, my first Barbie. And I put my first Barbie just up on the mantle, and what happened was sort of strange, which was that everybody who happened to come by, and in Iowa City people come by all the time because there's nothing else to do, so do they just walk down the street, and if they see you in your house, they come in. It's that kind of place, and it's all the young writers, and all these people would come in, not in groups, it wasn't like a tour thing, but they would come individually. And they would go over and they would start taking Barbie's clothes off, and it didn't matter if they were men or women. Everybody undressed her, which I thought was so weird. I'm like, I'm not going to look, I don't want to know. And then they all like confess these strange stories about their relationships or their sister's relationships, or how their sister put, like, you know those sewing pins that have different colored balls in the end, how they put them through the Barbie's head, and you know, maybe they poked out the other side, they hurt themselves, or you know, just different horrible things that they had done with this doll. And my story, not even written yet, started to take a much darker kind of a turn. So this is the story that I wrote, and then just as in that way of telling sort of tales out of school, I was at Iowa and I did this story there, and then whatever, it's a complicated thing, but I ended up coming back to New York, and I presented this story in a workshop at NYU, and I would say I've never gotten such a negative response to a piece of writing. They hated it. They truly hated it. And I remember thinking, that's so weird, because I don't get why they think this. It's just not possible. Barbie doesn't have a vagina. And I'm thinking, what the hell does that have to do with anything? You know, it's not like about reality, people. But it was fascinating to see, in a way, how one, small group of people could really, they had like an anaphylactic reaction to the story. So I'll read it to you. And luckily for me, I was sort of far enough along in my own development that I didn't cry, number one, or throw out the story. But anyway, this is a little bit from the beginning. And I have to remember, so this is a long time ago already. This is like could have been 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I was very young. A real doll. I'm dating Barbie. 3 afternoons a week, while my sister's at dance class, I take Barbie away from Ken. I'm practicing for the future. At first, I sat in my sister's room watching Barbie, who lived with Ken on a doily on top of the dresser. I was looking at her, but not really looking. I was looking and all of a sudden realized she was staring at me. She was sitting next to Ken, his khaki-covered thigh absently rubbing her bare leg. He was rubbing her, but she was staring at me. "Hi," I said. "Hello." "I'm Barbie," she said, and Ken stopped rubbing her leg. "I know. You're Jenny's brother." I nodded. My head was bobbing up and down like a puppet on a weight. "I really like your sister. She's sweet," Barbie said. "Such a good little girl. And especially lately, she makes herself so pretty." And she started doing her nails. I wondered if Barbie noticed that Miss Wonderful bit her nails, and that when she smiled, her front teeth were covered with little flecks of purple nail polish. I wondered if she knew that Jennifer colored in the chipped, chewed spots with purple magic markers and then sometimes sucked on her fingers, so not only did she have purple flecks of polish on her teeth, but her tongue was frequently the strangest shade of violet. "So listen, Barbie," I said, "would you like to go out for a while, get some fresh air, maybe take a spin around the old backyard?" "Sure," she said. I grabbed her by her feet. It sounds unusual, but I was too petrified to take her by the waist. I grabbed her by the ankles and carried her off like a popsicle stick. As soon as we were out back, sitting on the porch of what I used to call my fort, but which my sister and parents referred to as the playhouse, I started freaking. I was suddenly and incredibly aware that I was out with Barbie. I didn't know what to say. "So, what kind of Barbie are you?" I asked. "Excuse me?" "Well, from listening to Jennifer, I know there's day to night Barbie, magical Barbie, gift-giving Barbie, tropical Barbie, my first Barbie, and more." "I'm tropical," she said. "I'm tropical," she said, the same way a person might say I'm Catholic or I'm Jewish. "I came with a one-piece bathing suit, a brush, and a ruffle you can wear so many ways." We were quiet for a while. A leaf larger than Barbie fell from the maple tree above us, and I caught it just before it would have hit her. I half expected her to squeak, "You saved my life, I'm yours forever." Instead, she said in a perfectly normal voice, "Wow, big leaf."